Hey, what's going on, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the toolbox killers and the sick and twisted things Lawrence Bitticker and Roy Norris would do. But in order to get into that, we need to dive into the past of these two individuals and see just how their lives unraveled. Lawrence Sigmund Bitticker, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on September the 27th of 1940. He was an unwanted child to parents who did not want to have children, so because of that, he was placed in an orphanage and adopted by Mr. and Miss George Bitticker as an infant. Bitticker's adoptive father worked in the aviation industry, which required the family to move often throughout his childhood. Bitticker's first arrest would happen at the age of 12 for shoplifting. He would obtain a minor criminal record over the next 4 years for the same offense and petty theft, which would land him in the arms of juvenile authorities. Bitticker would later on claim these offenses occurred due to the lack of love he received as a child. Bitticker reported to have an IQ of 138, but considered school to be tedious, so he would drop out of high school in 1957, and by this stage, he and his adoptive parents were living in California. Norris's childhood recollections were filled with wrongful accusations while living with his biological parents and of being neglected by many of the foster families he lived with, and frequently being denied sufficient food or clothing. He also claimed to have been sexually abused when in the care of a Hispanic family, later stating the prejudice he held toward Hispanic people came from the neglect and abuse he endured as a child when placed in the care of this family. While living with his biological parents at the age of 16, Norris went to the home of a female relative who was in her early 20s and began speaking to her in a sexually suggestive manner. She ordered him to leave her house and had told Norris's father, who threatened to subject him to a beating, so Norris stole his father's car and drove it into the Rocky Mountains, where he attempted suicide by injecting pure air into an artery in his arm. He was later apprehended as a runaway and returned to live with his parents, and upon his return, Norris and his younger sister were told they were unwanted children and they intended to divorce when they both reached adolescence. 1 year later, Norris drops out of school and joins the United States Navy. He was then stationed in San Diego in 1965, and then in 1969 he was deployed to serve in the Vietnam War. He would not see active combat during his 4-month tour of duty, and he would be honorably discharged from the Navy after one tour of duty. Within days of Bitticker's parole from the California Youth Authority, he would be arrested for transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines, and in August 1959, he would be sentenced to 18 months in prison at the Oklahoma State Reformatory, where he would later finish the rest of that sentence at some prison in Springfield, Missouri. In 1960, Bitticker would be released from prison, but would soon revert to crime, and within months of his release, he would be arrested in Los Angeles for a robbery. And in May of 1961, he would be sentenced to 15 years in prison. The psychiatrist explained Bitticker as being manipulative and having concealed hostility. Bitticker would be released on parole in 1963 after completing 2 years of his sentence. But in October 1964, he would go to prison again for violating his parole. And in 1966, Bitticker would be diagnosed as a borderline psychopath, a manipulative individual, one who is unable to acknowledge the consequences of his own actions. Bitticker told one of the psychiatrists that his criminal activities gave him a feeling of self-importance, and that his environment and upbringing decreased his ability to resist committing crimes. Bitticker would be prescribed antipsychotic medication, and 1 year later, he would be released back into society. But he would not last long, and over the years, as he's growing into a man, he would keep on getting arrested. He would be in there for 3 years for theft, and then he'd be out for a year and go back in for another 3 years for burglary. It was just this ongoing cycle of crime after crime. In 1974, Bitticker would try and steal a steak from a supermarket and get caught by an employee. Bitticker would respond by stabbing this employee in the chest, nearly missing his heart. The employee Gary Louie would survive the stabbing, and Bitticker was convicted of the lesser charge. assault with a deadly weapon, and sent to California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. In November of 1969, Norris would be arrested for sexual offenses. He was charged with both rape and assault with attempt to commit rape, and then he had attempted to force his way into a car of a lone woman. And then in February 1970, Norris attempted to deceive a woman into letting him enter her home. But when she refused, he tried to break into her house, so the woman phoned the police, who arrested Norris before he had the opportunity to cause the woman any harm. About 3 months after the offense, Norris would be diagnosed by military psychologists with the schizoid personality disorder. He was given an administrative discharge from the Navy and labeled as psychological problems. In May 1970, Norris was on bail at the time for his latest offense, and while on bail, he would attack a female student whom he had been stalking on the grounds of the San Diego State University campus, and he would end up striking her in the head multiple times, almost killing her. After his release, he tried to pick up a woman walking home on his motorcycle, and when she declined, he attacked her and wrapped a scarf around her neck and drug her into nearby bushes where he would rape her. The woman did not resist out of fearing for her life. Right after the incident, she would report it to police, but they would be unsuccessful in tracking down Norris. However, a month later, she would find his motorcycle and write down the license plate and hand it over to the police. They would then find Norris and arrest him, and he would be sent to the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, where he would meet Bitticker and they would become good friends. From February to June 1979, Bitticker and Norris would pick up over 20 female hitchhikers, but they did not assault these girls in any way. These were just practice runs for them to develop ruses to lure girls into the van voluntarily, and while doing so, discovering secluded places. The following year in April, the pair found an isolated road in the San Gabriel Mountains. Bitticker would break open the lock gate with a crowbar and replace the lock with one he owned. Bitticker and Norris would kill their first victim, a 16-year-old girl named Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, on June 24, 1979. She would be last seen leaving a Presbyterian church meeting in Redondo Beach. Norris spotted Schaefer walking down a side street and made a remark to Bitticker, saying, "There's a cute little blonde." So at this point, they're trying to entice Schaefer by offering her marijuana. They try giving her a lift home, but she declines, and they pull her into the van, and she's screaming, and to muffle her screams, they crank the music, and they take the van and they drive it down to that fire road, where they previously had switched the locks, and it's just bad news from there. Despite initially screaming and her arms, feet, and mouth being bound by duct tape, Schaefer would quickly regain composure and offer no resistance and express no great concern for her safety. She would be raped by the both of them, one after another, and then strangled by Norris, but he wouldn't be able to follow through because of the disturbing look in her eyes. It would cause him to run and vomit, so Bitticker strangled her until she collapsed and convulsed. He then twisted a wire coat hanger around her neck with vice grip pliers until Schaefer's convulsions ceased and she was dead. Before she had been killed, she had pleaded with them to let her pray if they weren't going to let her go and kill her, but they wouldn't even allow her to pray. Bitticker and Norris would wrap her up in a shower curtain and then throw her over a steep cannon. Bitticker would then inform Norris that there wouldn't be any evidence left due to the animals eating her all up. On July 8, 1979, just 2 weeks after the murder of Schaefer, Bitticker and Norris would encounter an 18-year-old woman by the name of Andre Joy Hall, hitchhiking on the Pacific Coast Highway. As the pair slowed the van to offer Hall a lift, another vehicle pulled over and offered Hall a lift, which she accepted. Bitticker and Norris would then follow the vehicle from a distance until Hall exited the vehicle in Redondo Beach. And on this occasion, Norris would hide in the back of the van to dupe Hall into believing Bitticker was traveling alone inside the van. Bitticker offered Hall a cold drink from the cooler in the rear of the van. Norris, who had hidden behind a bedspread in the section of the van, pounced on Hall when she attempted to retrieve a drink, and Hall would put up a fight but was ultimately subdued by having her arms twisted behind her back, causing Hall to scream in pain and give in. Norris would then gag her with adhesive tape and bind her wrists and ankles. Bitticker and Norris would drive Hall over to the location, just as they did with Schaefer, but this time going further than where they had taken Schaefer, And once there, she was raped twice by Bitticker and once by Norris. And while Bitticker was raping Hall for the second time, Norris thinks he sees a vehicle's headlights approaching, so Bitticker places his hand over Hall's mouth and drags her into nearby bushes. Norris drives around in an effort to search for the vehicle, but never finds it, and once he returns back, she's forced by Bitticker to walk naked uphill beside the road, and then has her perform oral sex on him before ordering her to take a bunch of nude photos. Bitticker and Norris would end up driving Hall to a third location, where again, Bitticker would make Hall walk naked up a hill as Norris would leave to go get alcohol, and when Norris returned, Bitticker would be alone, and in his possession were 2 more photos he had taken, both which depicted Hall's face and expressions of the sheer terror Hall displayed as she begged for her life to be spared. Bitticker would drive an ice pick through her ear and into her brain, and then he would flip her over and drive an ice pick into her other ear and into her brain, so hard that he would break the handle off. And then he would strangle her and throw her body off a cliff. On September 3rd, Bitticker and Norris observed 2 girls, Jackie Doris Gilliam and Jacqueline Lee Lamp, sitting at a bus stop bench near Hermosa Beach. Lamp and Gilliam had been hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway before Bitticker and Norris watched them as they were resting at the bus stop. They offered the girls a ride, which Gilliam and Lamp accepted. Inside, both girls were offered marijuana by Norris, which they accepted, but not long after, both girls realized Bitticker had steered the van off the Pacific Coast Highway and was driving towards the San Gabriel Mountains. And Bitticker, just as he did before with the other victims, would have Lamp stripped down and pose for pornographic pictures, and also had Norris take several pictures of himself and Gilliam, both nude and clothed. Bitticker would also rape Gilliam and create a tape recording of himself raping her, forcing Gilliam to pretend like she was his cousin and informing Gilliam to feel free expressing her pain. Bitticker would torture Gilliam by stabbing her in the breast with an ice pick and using vice grip pliers to tear off one of her nipples. After almost 2 days of captivity, Lamp and Gilliam would be murdered. Gilliam would also be struck in each ear with an ice pick and then strangled. Lamp would be struck in the head by Norris with a sledgehammer and then strangled by Bitticker. Bitticker believed he had killed Lamp, but she was not dead. And when she opened her eyes, Norris again bludgeoned her with a sledgehammer until Bitticker strangled her to death. Gilliam and Lamp were then thrown over an embankment into the Chaparral. Bitticker would abduct a 16-year-old girl by the name of Shirley Lynette Ledford on October 31st, 1979. Ledford was abducted as she stood outside a gas station, hitchhiking home from a Halloween party in Sunland Tujunga, a suburb of Los Angeles. Upon accepting the ride and entering the van, Ledford was offered marijuana by Norris, which she refused, while Bitticker drove the van to a secluded street. Norris would then draw a knife and bound and gag Ledford with construction tape. Bitticker would then trade places with Norris, who drove aimlessly for an hour, as Bitticker remained with Ledford in the back part of the van. After removing construction tape from her mouth and legs, Bitticker tormented Ledford, initially slapping and mocking her, then beating her with his fist as he repeatedly shouted for her to say something. Ledford began screaming, and as she's screaming, Bitticker shouts for her to scream louder and begins to strike her while saying, "What's the matter? Don't you like to scream?" And as Ledford began to cry, she pleaded with Bitticker, repeatedly saying, "No, don't touch me," and in response to that, he ordered her to scream as loud as she wished. He would then strike her with a hammer, over and over, and beat her breast continuously with his fist. He would also torture her with pliers, and in between these beatings, he would rape and sodomize her. Ledford can be heard on tape pleading for it all to stop, saying things like, "Oh no," as sounds are being made by Bitticker, extracting a sledgehammer and getting pliers from the toolbox. Shortly after Norris would switch places with Bitticker, he'd switch on the tape recorder. He would then shout at Ledford saying, "Go ahead and scream or I'll make you scream." And in response, Ledford pleaded, "I'll scream if you stop hitting me," and then emitted several high-pitched screams as Norris encouraged her to continue until he ordered her to stop. Norris then smashed Ledford's left elbow, breaking it, and as Ledford cried out in pain, she also begged and pleaded with him not to be hit again, saying, "Please don't hit me again." And in response, Norris raised the sledgehammer, and as Ledford screamed over and over again, saying, "No," Norris then smashed Ledford 25 consecutive times in the same elbow before asking her, "What are you sniveling about?" as Ledford continuously screamed and wept. After 2 hours of captivity, Norris killed Ledford by strangling her with a wire coat hanger, which he tightened with pliers. Ledford did not react much to being strangled. Although she died with her eyes open, Bitticker opted to discard her body on a random lawn in order to view the reaction from the press. The pair would drive to a randomly selected house in Sunland, where Norris discarded her body in a bed of ivy on a front lawn. Ledford's body was found by a jogger the following morning, and an autopsy revealed that in addition to having been sexually violated, she died of strangulation after receiving extensive blunt force trauma to the face, head, breast, and left elbow, with her cranium sustaining multiple fractures. Genitalia and rectum had been torn very badly from pliers being inserted into her body. In addition to that, she had a massive puncture wound on her left hand and a slash on her right. Bitticker later claimed the tape recording the pair created of Ledford's obvious abuse and torture was nothing more than the evidence of a threesome, adding that, toward the end of the recording, Ledford was screaming for him and Norris to kill her. In February 1980, Norris and Bitticker were charged with the murders of the 5 girls, and Norris had accepted a plea bargain in which he would testify against Bitticker, and returned that the prosecution would not seek the death penalty against him. After months of them going around picking women up and killing them, Norris would meet up with an old friend and tell him all about what him and Bitticker had been up to, and their plans for future girls. His friend would later call Hermosa Beach police and report them. Roy Lewis Norris would die from natural causes in prison at the age of 72 on February 24, 2020. And Lawrence Sigmund Bitticker would die in prison on death row from natural causes at the age of 79 on December 13, 2019. Well, that's the story of the toolbox killers and the sick and twisted minds these 2 individuals shared. My condolences go out to these victims' families. Well, if you liked the video, leave me a like and subscribe while you're at it. And on that note, I will see you guys later.